people in the European Union, I will call upon the Prime Minister to open the case of stands in his name. Hear, hear.
For example, for 30 days for vacation without visa, if you want to stay longer, you'll need visa as you, for example, coming from Serbia. Or if you want to work or go there are students, you'll still need visa. That is the model that we're presenting. We believe it's completely fair. Firstly, 4 points. First point is it's going to be, we believe that economy is going to be better. How? We believe when you have a free movement of the people, we believe that lots of lower skilled workers are coming from the countries that are underdeveloped within the EU to the countries that are more developed. Like, for example, people from the eastern part of the EU coming to the west. We believe it hurts those countries. How? Because those people are ready to work for much lower wages than the people who are living in those countries. For example, people from, to Austria, they're ready to work for much less money than those people. How this is problematic? Because we believe that countries have the biggest duty toward their citizens, because they are the ones who improved the economy, they are the ones who improved those countries to be more developed, to be better to them. When we have these problems, we have lots of competition and those citizens are harmed. How? They are the need to compete and work for lower wages, for lower amounts of money, rather lower than they would work if there were no so many immigrants. And secondly, they don't have a job at all. We see that we have huge unemployment in those countries, especially among the youth. For example, 20% of young people in Spain are unemployed. We believe it's really, really problematic. What are the harms? Because those people are firstly unemployment or either unsatisfied on the welfare. Secondly, because Euroscepticism rise. Now, to my second point. This is going to be decreased Euroscepticism. Why? Because when you have this, we believe that it is pretty much obvious that the amount of immigration is going to be lower. Lots of people who are now just going and leaving are going to go, not going to go. Why? Because it's going to be not going to be just that easy to go like that. Well, we believe it's really good. Why? Because this is going to decrease Euroscepticism. Now we see that Euroscepticism is on the rise in the EU. We see that parties like UKIP, like the Le Pen's party in France, are gaining more and more popularity. They're getting in the European Parliament. Well, why is this problematic? Because those are the countries that usually have ideas that are genius, that are against the basic values of the humanity. Furthermore, those parties are actually because they when they're in the European Parliament, they're making the decision-making process slower. How? Because their crux of existence of those parties is not to exist EU. When they become members, when they have more and more members in the Parliament, in the EU Parliament, they want to make the European Parliament as inefficient as it is. So it's much harder for those for other parties to gain majority for other things. That's why the decision-making process is slower, and we believe it really harms other countries because when you need more time to make decisions, it's really, really bad. We believe that when this motion passed, firstly, it's going to be less immigration. So those parties will have less proofs, Mr. Speaker, say that their agenda is right. They have less people to blame. And furthermore, if we believe that that's why a lot of that Euroscepticism is going to actually decline. No. Thirdly, we believe that this is going to be beneficial for future joining of the other countries to the EU, like for example Serbia or Macedonia or all other countries, especially on the Balkans. Nowadays we believe that all countries are afraid of letting those countries join to the EU. Why? Because they're afraid that those lower workers who want to work for lower money are going to overflow other countries. The same in fact with Romania and Bulgaria. People were afraid that those people are going to come to those countries and actually take their jobs. That's why Romania, Bulgaria needed much more time than the other countries to join the EU. We believe when this motion passes, the other countries will have more interest to let other countries like Serbia, like Macedonia and the others to join the EU. We believe that this is going to benefit those countries as well. Before I proceed on the fourth point, yes?
Can you please provide us with examples on which those immigration happened just because some countries entered the EU if possible?
Yeah, once when the Romania entered the EU, lots of Romanian workers went, for example, to Denmark and actually started doing the lower paid jobs. And that's why Danish People's Party, that's a really basically racist party, is gaining momentum and lots of support in the Denmark. We believe it's really problematic. That's what my first 3 points of the speech, basically. Now, fourthly, we believe why skilled workers and students are not going to be harmed. Well, we believe that even if you are, for example, a doctor, if you're an engineer or a student who wants to go abroad, you still can go to those countries. Just you need to apply for a visa. We believe that comparatively, that's not something that you cannot do. It's not something that's actually going to make you not go to the other countries. Why? Because those people, if they have a better chance of succeeding, we believe that, like for example, spending 10 days just to take some documentation and get the visa is not something that's going to deter you. So comparatively, we believe that we are still going to have the higher skilled workers, which is really, really good. So we believe that that's why we're going to take the parts of the immigration that we like. We're going to allow the better skilled workers to go to the other countries because they are prosperous for all the countries, but the lower skilled workers who are actually not that beneficial, who take the jobs of the people, or even if they don't take the jobs, are perceived as the ones who take jobs, and that's why they use as example and from those populist party are going to be in decrease. So that's why we believe it's going to be beneficial. Okay, what I brought you in my Prime Minister's speech. 4 points. We explained you that firstly, the employment is going to be higher in other countries because it's going to be less immigration. Secondly, that Euroscepticism is going to be on the fall, and that there is now a problem with that. Thirdly, that there are bigger chances of joining the EU of other countries. And fourthly, that all other skilled workers that we need, that we still can get, they are not going to be harmed that much. They're going to be harmed just in the way that they have to apply for a visa, and they can get it much easily. So for all these reasons, we are more than proud to propose this motion.
I thank the speaker for his fine speech, and I will be called upon the Leader of Opposition to open the case on behalf of the
In today's world, people are entitled to several privileges just because of the place they were born in. A German citizen will have much more privileges just because he was born in Germany. But what we forget today is that nobody actually chooses the place they were born. You choose what to do with your life, and that's what we stand for in this debate. We stand for pursuit of happiness. We stand for equality. So what we are going to bring you as an opening opposition today is how economically that's way better, and how culturally that's also good. And we're going to explain also in our rebuttals the visa problem and why visas are problematic. I'm very proud here as a Kosovo Albanian. I need a visa to go everywhere in the EU, so I'm pretty much familiar with the visas they're talking about. And I'm going to explain why visas are actually bad. Okay, but before going to that, let's go into the rebuttal. The idea of cheap labor coming back and forth, coming from the opening government all the time, that cheap labor is actually going to ruin everything. More people going, more competition, cheap labor. But the problem here is that there's actually two ways you can solve that. First, you can accept it and say that it's free market. If you have too many people for a job, then that's free market. But if a country wants to interfere in the economy, which Germany did, they call it Mindestlohn in German, which means that you actually put a threshold on how low a wage can get. That's when, like Angela Merkel's party did that in several parts of Germany. They put this threshold. You cannot get a lower wage, for example, in Munich, than 9 euros per hour. So problem solved. No lower wages, no cheap labor. Problem solved if you put a threshold on that. So, and they had this idea of unemployment. Actually, we see it as an eastern part of the. If, for example, Germany, France, or whichever Western country needs more people, needs more human capital, we really would see it as something good. to get that human capital from the young population which is unemployed in other parts of Europe. And why economically, I'm going to bring up my point here, why economically it's better, it's because we give a chance to the working class to actually move from a border to another if they can't pursue their happiness, if they can't pursue their careers in their own countries. We give them a chance to go in the other country and to work over there. Why? How does this affect economically in a macro level and micro level? In a macro level, we give bigger countries this chance for having human capital, which that population is unemployed anyway. They're not doing anything, so we give the big countries their chance to have more human capital in those countries. That's why we had UK in the first place, opening borders for Romania and Bulgaria last year to have more human capital in them. But in the micro level, we still have an impact on the countries where they are coming from, because those people they don't go with their whole families, and they're really attached to their own culture and own families, which makes them send remittances here and then to their own families. Why remittances are important? Because their incomes coming to the countries, and families that get those remittances do the consumption in their own country, which that consumption translates into taxes which go into the states. I'll take yours.
Yeah, well, even if what you said is true, well, why don't you allow countries to decide? If they need low-skilled labor, they will give lots of visas to low-skilled laborers and problem solved.
Okay, what's the problem with visas? I'm going to come to the point of visas in my third point, so I'm going to answer your question over there. And they also talked about the decrease of Euroscepticism. Here comes our point about the cultural point. Well, if we remember Europe before the 2 world wars which happened in the world, happened just because of Europe and just because of the nationalism that was going up here in Europe. But how the perception changed is when we started opening borders, when we started understanding the cultures of each other, right? So people, when they start moving, they start engaging more with each other and start knowing that they actually are not that different as they thought they would be. But if we keep them inside their country, we can give more rise to this, even to fascist or to extreme nationalist parties saying that nobody wants us, and we're going to give rights to these sort of ideologies. And what's the other problem in this, the cultural problem, is that those people will be more isolated than they are, right? They still can move, but they will still be more isolated. How does this, why is this bad? It's because that the general image they get from outside, they cannot get it through going there, through living there. They only get it through media. So the problem with that is that the media might be used very differently from some parties which own some media channels in, let's say, Eastern Europe, and give rise to this populism, to this extreme nationalism ideas. So they also talked about that in the future they can join, that we believe that if we keep borders open, we are halfway there, we are in the process of joining the EU. But if we close them, the moment of transition is going to be much more extreme than it would be in the first place, because if you keep one country inside for a long time, then the people are going to think that they're sort of imprisoned in that country, and at the first moment when you give them, when you join EU, all of them are going to leave because they felt alienated from the EU, and they felt that they were being held sort of imprisoned or isolated. Why visas are a major problem here? Visas, there are 3 main reasons why visas are a problem. You usually need a lot of documents in order to get a visa. Sometimes you cannot get your visa in times, and that's a lot of times that is the case. And you have to pay visa fees. In the documents that you have to go for a visa, you also have to show your bank account, whoever works in your family, etc. and etc. So these are too many documents for a lot of citizens who can't afford to go abroad. These delays, and even sometimes you have visa appointments being filled in the next 2 months and you can't get a visa appointment. That's why you can't go even to a cultural event or whatsoever in the future. And those delays, actually, at the end of the day, a lot of documents that you bring, the fees that you have to pay, and the delays that you get through having a lot of appointments give you less incentive to go and apply for a visa in the general level. So what we have shown you today is in economy, how is it good in a micro level and in a macro level from both countries, receiving countries and sending countries. We've shown you how culturally we are more open, we understand more each other, we give less rise to populism, and we showed you what the problem with visas is and how visas give less incentive to move. I urge you to oppose.
I thank the speaker for his fine speech and will be called on Deputy Prime Minister.
May I? Okay. Mr. Speaker, the reason why we created EU, or firstly known as European Economic Community, it is to improve our individual economies of each country. Therefore, reason why UK, France, Germany joined and created the EU is to improve not the economy of Romania, but the economy of their self, and to improve the economic lives of their own citizens. And therefore, the arguments such as Romanian workers will send money and benefit to the Romanian economy does not, UK should not care about, because the primary duty is towards the own citizens, and the opening opposition side failed to prove us why should we also have a duty towards the other citizens of the European Union that are not citizens of our country such. Okay, but we proved to you otherwise by providing you reasons why European Union is created, or why every country is created to cater the needs of the population who lives on its territory. Okay, the rebuttal. When they say to you that you can simply lower the wages, or you can just unleash the free market. Free market, firstly, is not a value per se. It is created and moderated in order to cater our needs and the needs of the economy. Therefore, we can moderate the market in this way by limiting this. But furthermore, putting the minimum wage threshold will not solve the issue, because now you have more incentive to put that threshold lower, therefore minimizing standards for the part of your population than it would be if you put a threshold for minimum wage combined with this kind of policy. Therefore, we believe that these policies can be combined, and the part of your population that you should primarily care about will benefit of, as my partner spoke about, but never refuted. Secondly, the logic that those countries need human capital is such. Never responded to the things that Ilya gave you, that those countries have already human capital, but that human capital now became unemployable because of the cheaper human capital. And secondly, even if it is the case that those countries need a human capital, those countries can decide and to provide numbers of visas that will accommodate their market and their needs. We do not believe that we harm them in that way. Final point. That this will lead to a rise of the nationalism as such. Firstly, it explains by logic that if you have a visa, you will have a negative image in the media. But the problem is that those countries those people who immigrate to the UK and who immigrate in the Western Europe as such already have a negative image because they're perceived as the ones who are poor, the ones who are uneducated, and the ones who steal our jobs. Therefore, that narrative is pre-existent, and but they never respond to our analysis how we will change this, because you will now have less immigrants to support that narrative. You will not have to back up the stories that UKIP is telling to you. Now UKIP will not have to back up their lunatic policies. But furthermore, what kind of immigrants you will now have in your country? And that is how the image of immigrants will change, an image of those countries, if we decide to take them into the consideration. You will now have the employable, the ones who will not steal your job because you decided and you provide them on some certain criteria. And they will be more educated one, as Ilya explained in the final part of his speech, that educated workers will now travel because we will decide whether students will be the immigrants that we will now accept to our countries. Therefore, we will build a positive image of people outside of our borders. And final point, we live in the 21st century. We now have the internet and we know each other's culture. Even without the travel, we can get to know and not to be afraid of the other people's culture as such. Okay, closing.
So if you take a look at the political agenda of the Nationalistic Party, it's not about what kind of migrants are present in two countries, are migrants into the country. So limiting actually the freedom of movement, you're not changing that perception.
Yeah, but the problem is there are bigots by default. But the problem is that now the target the population who is unsatisfied and they cannot gather the body and they cannot gather more votes. Therefore, we are weakening them because not providing them reasons to gather more votes. Okay, to continue with our case, we talked to you about ever-skepticism, and that ever-skepticism is based on immigrants. I already explained. We'll now have my partner already told you about how this weakens the European institution and such. But how does it reflect? We still need the EU. We're not there to abandon the EU. Therefore, all the positive things that the European Union does nowadays, because of this free movement policy, are now endangered or are not as effective as they could be because of the members of the UKIP or members of or members of Marine Le Pen party that are standing in the European Parliament and such. Therefore, we are neglecting our interests on the other fields as well, not just the interests of Western countries, but also the interests of the Eastern countries and the countries that should also benefit from the European Union and whose people want to emigrate to the Western countries as such. And final point, EU as the motivation and why EU should care about Western Balkans and the countries that will join. We say to you now that now those countries will see the EU as more achievable goal. Why so? Because now European Union would not be so scared, will be less, as we say, there are still certain criteria beside that those countries can apply to. But when they say that UK, Germany, the countries that has most influence inside the European Union will not be afraid of them, and then will be more eager to receive them inside the European Union. Now they will see EU as an achievable goal, and therefore their population will be less Eurosceptic. And why we need Western Balkan, why European Union has an interest in those regions, it is because they need a stable region with, who accepts European Union policies even before the European Union chiefs, not for transitional justice as such, but also for a cooperation with those regions as such. Because European Union cannot spread furthermore to the east because of the clashes it has with Russia, but therefore the Western Balkan is crucial for spreading European interests and cooperating with the east to the eastern borders. Okay, what we showed you today. We showed you that by criteria that European Union is created, and that is economy, we have the right to adjust policies to cater the needs of our own population because life standard of our own population in the thing most. We showed you that on a comparative, we don't lose much things except apply on your visa on time, and therefore we are proud to.
The opening opposition today proudly stands for the freedom of movement in order to achieve the pursuit of happiness of the citizens in the EU. Now, I'm going to try to first rebut some of the points brought by the second speaker of the government and to tell you why the whole idea of the government is wrong, and then to move on our constructive points and to bring new materials on that. Now, first of all, their main concern during the whole speeches is that this will affect immigration and this will empower immigration. And I think that's what they say. Because, and they say that immigration is bad because like people will go, those that are unemployed in those poor countries, like more undeveloped countries, will go and work outside of their countries. What we believe here is that my partner develop this in two levels, and the main level here that's the response to their argument is the micro level and how this will help the countries. Now we know that these countries, those undeveloped countries, they need people, of course, but those people are unemployed right now. They cannot afford jobs for them. So we're just stopping them to pursue to empower themselves economically. But second of all, if those people go outside of the countries and work in any other countries that can provide that job, which we think is not problematic, then we say that the remittances are very important. Now, why they are important? Because we know that those countries they need money. They need money to increase the consumption. Therefore, those money will stay within the country within a circle. Why is it that? It will help consumption. If the people have money, it will increase the consumption, and the companies will increase the production. That means that there will be more jobs in that country. But second of all, even some of the smart guys from the closing government come up with the idea of the brain drain. We believe that can be an issue. But why that's not the case in those undeveloped countries? Because we believe that those people who are unemployed, they don't have the chance to get educated on how to build new jobs and how to create new jobs. And we believe that staying within that country, that won't help any better. But what happens if we let them go? We let them get experience countries that have and that can provide that experience. Now, with education or even by the experience in the work. And what will they do? I strongly believe that when they get that experience, they will help other people in their countries, in their origin countries, to even further and develop their skills. Now, second of all, in micro level, when it comes to economy, we believe EU needs that. But first of all, let's rebuttal their idea of the concept of EU. They're saying that the basic concept of why EU was created is just to of increasing the development of those countries. We believe that's not the only true behind that. We believe that the idea was raised by Robert Schuman and the other guy, which I cannot remember his name, and their idea was that to bring France and Germany together to cooperate, but not just to cooperate, because that was the main source of conflict during the World War II, and we believe that's problematic if we stop that. If we stop that thing doing. Why is that problematic? Because when it came to the origin of the freedom of movement, they said that, okay, now we have the economic development, but we need people to move, because that's an value to that greater idea to prevent peace, to prevent war, and to get the peace in Europe. And we think that after the World War II, we don't have that incentive to get into war because of of our past problems. We see this falling into our cultural argument, that I will try to explain furthermore on my second point. Now, the idea of freedom of movement means that those people can choose to work in different places. And yes, that if that's beneficial for them, then we should give them. We don't allow them do that. We believe that goes against the concept of EU. What they said as opening government, the Euroscepticism will be less if we put visa for them. We believe that's quite different. And why is that quite different? We will incentivize those nationalist parties such as Maria Le Pen and UKIP in UK. They have this Euroscepticism because of all these issues, and we'll just give them more power on those ideas. And we believe that's particularly wrong on this case, and we should not let them empower themselves. Opening.
Even if we concede that richer countries have some duty towards poorer countries, status quo leads to strengthening of far right, which results policies that refuse to bail out Greece, which is a poor country, and wants to kick them out from the EU. How does it help poor countries?
I will try to explain that during my constructive. But now, moving to the cultural argument. Now, we believe it's very important, and you should value that. And why is that important? Because, it's not that important in Western liberal democracy, because they have created this idea of the states, like Germany. And we believe the whole goal of EU creation is established. But what we need to do is to help those southeastern countries to get this idea differently. And we believe that's very important. But when it comes to visa, that stops. And they're saying that, okay, people can get to know each other by internet. We don't see that going that way because we don't see internet as a direct interaction with people, and we believe that if people want to go and work and find and see how the working culture works happens there, and yeah, they can get that idea. But also those countries, like for example those countries here that see the idealist EU Western countries, they will understand that that's not really idealistic. But also if they see that that's true, they will get new ideas and will try to improve themselves. And we see that visa as their model is very harmful for those countries. And we believe, and in my final word during this debate is that I miss Thessaloniki. That's personal, don't take it. But I miss Thessaloniki open just because I couldn't get an appointment to the Greek consulate in my country because they put visa on that. I missed that chance. But there will be many chances for many people in the Balkans and in other countries that will miss these chances, and I believe that's pretty harmful. Thank you.
I found that speaker for his fine speech. I thank everyone on the top half for their excellent contributions so far, and I will be called upon the member of government to continue to
So it is true that the EU's role in the time of Robert Schuman was effectively to create peace in Europe, but that's no reason why that should be the very same today. We tell you that war in Europe is probably very unlikely. We'll give you reasons why. We think the main purpose of the EU should be to improve the well-being of individual countries. 3 points in this speech. 1, why do those states have moral obligation towards their own citizens? That's something in the opening just asserted. We'll give you reasons why. 2, what are the harms which come to the state that receives immigrants? And 3, what are the harms to original states? Before that, 4 points of rebuttal that don't fit into this. 1, human capital and how that can help those countries. It probably can in some instances. That's why states should be allowed to make individual immigration decisions. In some cases, immigrants benefit your economy. In some others, they don't. Should be left up to member states rather than making a prima facie rule that anyone can move whenever they want. 2, visas. Only shortly. The arguments they give are mostly about tourist visas, and at best are a reason why we should keep a visa-free regime in the EU. When people make applications for immigrant visas, the very big decision that is something that you will be, because that's a big decision for you, you will be willing to take the 2 months waiting process in time because you're probably going to live there for a very long time. Plus, you also have those problems when you arrive there, so have to apply with authorities. 3, when it comes to the cultural understanding, so 3 more replies here. 1, because you have very cheap travel over Europe, you have cultural bonds which will build over 60 years, war and conflicts are unlikely. 2, you have economic bonds, which means that those countries are their biggest trading partners. We don't think this will significantly change. So conflicts will still be unlikely. And 3, as we already told you, the EU can simply change its purpose towards becoming primarily an economic union. So obligations to poor countries. They say that we should help poorer countries. Then we have 2 replies here. 1, then why are you limiting this just to the EU? According to their own logic, we should abolish all limits on immigration. We think that would be very bad for a number of reasons, but if closing wants to go down that line, we'll be happy to reply to them in our whip. 2, there are other ways in which you can help developing countries, like development aid, like investments in those countries. Why is a full lifting of limits on immigration a necessary one? We need to hear proof of that in order for them to claim that point. Why do states primarily have moral obligations toward their own citizens? 1, because they have unique power over those citizens, which means they have unique coercive power, which, say, my country has over me, which is far greater than the coercive power of any other country. For instance, the state taxes me and the state can draft me in the army. Other states don't have an option to do that. Two, governments of those states were elected by those very same citizens. Now, the European Parliament is also elected, but most of the EU legislation is put forward by the Commission, which is by and large an unelected and somewhat unaccountable body. So what we claim here is that the main obligation of the EU countries is towards their own citizens rather than towards EU citizens. Two, what are the harms to states which take in immigrants? Know that, for instance, in the UK, you have over 120,000 Romanians, over 600,000 Poles. We tell you that there are problems with taking all these people in. One is minimal wage legislation, which was already pointed out by OG. Now, even if we accept opening op's reply, which is just instate new minimum wage legislation, there are two other harms which they can't deal with. What are those? One, you have a huge rise in xenophobic discourse. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, there are some objective harms which come from immigration. They're often exaggerated by political parties. So note, for instance, in a lot of EU countries, people estimate the number of immigrants as being 100 times higher than what it is. What does this do? This poisons discourse within parliamentary politics, when often policies are made just on the basis of let's prevent immigrants from coming in, or let's make lives worse for immigrants. This leads to suboptimal policies because the decisions of votings are made on imperfect decision by voters, which means that discourse about relevant issues is drowned out. The second harm is the absorption of immigrants. Note that previously in the European Union, absorption was easier because of two reasons. One, initially the EU was mostly a union of richer countries, so people didn't have that much of an incentive to move. When the average wage in the UK is 6 or 7 times higher than the one in Romania, there's a much bigger incentive for people to move. Secondly, also, we tell you that the transport costs of moving from a country to country have reduced significantly. You can fly almost anywhere in Europe by low-cost airline. What does that mean? That you have far higher groups of immigrants than you previously had, which leads to problems like ghettoization. Note that in the UK, French immigrants who came in the 80s were very easy to integrate. But now you have Bulgarians and you have Romanians who are mostly concentrated in northeast London. So what are the problems with the ghettoization of groups? Several. One, it leads to hatred toward all immigrants, even ones who came there previously. Secondly, those people often live in poverty in those countries. And three, provision of mass services is getting far more expensive. So when you have to give them teachers in their own language because they don't speak English or don't speak French, that means the functioning of public services is far harder. So what are the harms to the countries they come from? When it comes to remittances, those people mostly move into areas of high cost of living and of lower wages. That means that they have less disposable income. So the amount of money that goes back into those countries on remittances is usually very low. Two, we tell you that when it comes to a problem of the brain drain, now we recognize that some people that even if you implement this policy, some people will get immigration visas. But precisely because of the problems that opening up tells you, less people will do that than in the status quo. With brain drain. Note that, for instance, when companies want to make investments, they're usually long-term investments. So if I look for cheap labor, I probably won't even open a factory in Eastern Europe. Rather than that, I'll open it in East Asia. So when companies look for investments, they look for areas which are sustainable in the long run. When I know that the best workers in the area are likely to move somewhere else in the future, I'm far less likely to engage in investment. That means that those countries end up being far poorer than they originally were. We also tell you that these people who will leave now are often the ones who will start companies in those respective countries, which also means that those countries get poorer. Now, so when you implement this, when it comes to visas, one, as I said, less people will go. Two, there's an opportunity cost to getting an immigrant visa, so that means that not all people will pursue them. And lastly, not all people will get immigrant visas, which means that you have less of a brain drain. The EU has changed. Its main goal should be to improve the well-being of every individual state. This only increases the gap. Please propose.
Thank you for this fine speech, and I will make a member of opposition to open the case for
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, what this side of the table is going to prove to you today, firstly, that we believe in the idea of the free market, and that free market means free trade of goods and also free trade of people, but that these two things basically correlate to each other and are codependent, and one can basically not coexist without the other. And the second thing, what is the idea of the EU and this whole idea of you being a EU? Let's just engage in some rebuttal. So the first thing they say is that these countries have the obligation towards their citizens. Now we say yes, that is correct. You firstly have the obligation towards your citizen, but then you also have the obligation towards the EU, because you committed to the idea of the European Union. You entered into the idea of the European Union. You still proceed to hold elections for the EU Parliament, and therefore, because you have committed to that idea, you also have obligations for the migrants who come from the other countries, but basically you give more to your citizens. For example, they are the only ones who have the right to vote in your country, and not the migrants. The second thing they talk about is about nationalistic parties. Now we believe that if we support this idea, and I'm going to explain this further in my case. Now if we support this idea, we basically support Euroscepticism, and we believe that this will lead to even a huge rise of nationalistic parties within the EU Parliament. And lastly, they talk about that people don't like immigrants. Now we say that firstly, immigration is still going to happen, and they didn't explain us how this is going to solve the problem, because there is still a gap job in these developed countries and a necessity for job. And secondly, we believe that people from the European Union should have the preferential status. And lastly, because of the fact that we have similar values within the European Union, rather than someone who's going to come from Indonesia or someone that's going to come from India, is basically preferential and a lot better for them to employ someone from Bulgaria or Romania or Croatia rather than someone from India. And lastly, they talk about ghettoization. Now we believe that ghettoization can be solved in a ghettoization can be solved in a different manner. But even if it can, you're still going to have migrants from India, Malaysia. You're still going to have migrants from India, Malaysia, whatever, from underdeveloped countries, because these people basically ask for a lot less money, and you're still going to have ghettoization of those migrants, just as well you have ghettoization in the USA coming from Chinatown. And lastly, they talked about brain drain. Now, and their main explanation here was because of the fact that people can move, investors don't feel safe to invest there. Now we say that if you provide a person with a stable salary and basically a good way of living, they don't really have that much intention to move somewhere in a place that's unknown to them. And now let's go to our Now let's go to our arguments. So firstly, the economical benefits. Now there are two kinds of nations: the rich nations, right? Germany and France, and there are the poor nations. Now what happens in the rich nation, and this was somewhat explained from the first opposition, they have a decrease of natality, they need the labor force, and basically we say that people from this nation refuse to work these treaty jobs, the dirty, demanding jobs that only migrants really actually want to work these jobs, because they're gonna work, they're willing to work anything. And lastly, they talked about how we can apply visas and have migrants coming from other countries. Now we say, firstly, EU citizens should have the preferential status, and I'm going to explain this in my point of what the idea of EU citizenship is. And secondly, because of the fact that someone from Bulgaria who has been taught in school what the idea of the European Union is, who has been taught the values that you should have free media, that you should have EU Parliament, they are more similar to the idea of the European Union rather than someone who's going to come from a much poorer country or someone who's going to come from the USA, because of the fact that they do not have the same values. And let's talk about the poor nations, right? Bulgaria and Romania. Now this is a very bad situation for these countries. They have to trade goods with the rich nations. Now their goods cannot compete on the market because Germany has a lot bigger factories and a lot more effective factories, and thus we have a lot cheaper products in Romania who are being sold from German factories. Now this is a problem here because Bulgarian and Romanian products cannot compete on the market, but they compensate with that, with the fact that workers from Bulgaria come to rich countries, get the money, and bring them home to remittances. Now, the first opposition mentioned something about remittances, but the beauty of the remittances here is the fact of the matter that this money basically stayed within the European Union. If migrants come from Malaysia or from other Asian countries or from African countries, the problem here is that those money that are being returned from remittances do not stay within the European Union, but basically leave the European Union. And these rich countries eventually have to help these poor countries because we're all codependent on we cannot allow another situation where basically Germany is taxing the people, their own citizens, in order to bail out the Greek Greek economy failing out. Now we say because of the fact that eventually you have to help those small countries because you're dependent on each other, it's basically a lot better to help them and to give them jobs and to let them bring home their money instead of just giving them money freely and taxing your own citizens in order to provide them with that money. And lastly, I want to talk about this whole idea of what EU membership and EU citizenship means. Now right now, no thank you. Now right now, in order to get in the European Union, you have to place some policies within your country, like free media, free education, no discrimination, European Parliament. Now the idea of being a EU citizen is somewhat broken by this motion because of the fact I cannot feel as an EU citizen if I cannot enter a place where I am so-called an EU citizen. I cannot correlate with something, with a motion that I belong to something, and on the other hand, I cannot enter that place. And lastly, we hold European elections, right? The European Parliament elections exist. Now, right now, we believe that by supporting this motion, we're going to support Euroscepticism. We're basically going to provide them the message that, yes, governments are okay with the fact that we should always put the nationalistic need in front of the need of the European Union as a whole. Now, why do we see this as a problem? Because now, right now, we have NDP in the parliament, Godendon in the parliament, the Front Nation, the French Nationalistic Party in the parliament. Now, we see a problem here because they basically provide an anti-EU agenda. Now we say, if we in place this policy, the Euroscepticism is actually rising even further, and you're not solving the problem that you basically, the first and the second government want to solve. You're going to, instead of solving the problem, you're going to increase the Euroscepticism because of the fact that I cannot feel a citizen as a member of a place if I cannot enter that place, if I don't come in contact with some people, if I'm not provided with free education coming from the European Union, if I can't meet with people, I cannot feel as a EU citizen. And because of the fact that we believe that the economic dependency of these countries is so huge, and at the end of the day, the rich countries are gonna have to bail out the poor countries, it's a lot better, instead of getting to that place, to stop that from happening. So for all these reasons, I beg you to oppose the motion. Thank you.
I thank the Speaker for a fine speech, and I will call upon the government to conclude the case on behalf of the government.
So what we claimed from the start of the government bench is that this is a policy which both helps the countries which are recipients right now and helps the countries which would otherwise lose migration. What we claim, though, is the primary obligation of states is to their own citizens, and that's including EU states. There were several reasons for this which we hear in the extension speech. One, because states have unique power over their own citizens. They have the power to coerce them. They have the power to tax them. And coming along with that power are obligations. That is necessary if you aren't simply going to have a relationship between a government and slaves, and instead between government and citizens. As a result, they have reciprocal and primary obligations to those individuals. Secondly, even if you do not believe that states have unique obligations to their own citizens and have obligations in general, the opposition case does not give you those. Why? Because they seem to want to be limited within the European Union, which actively harms those from outside the European Union. Because when you take 600,000 workers from Poland and the United Kingdom, you're far less likely to take in workers from other disadvantaged countries. Closing opposition want to claim that the reason why you have obligations as a state to other EU members is because you have signed these treaties. I concede that these treaties have been signed. In most circumstances, they were signed with very little public accountability. Since joining the EU, there's been very few referendums that further the EU policy in most countries. Things like Maastricht did not have support by referenda or the majority of the population in most countries. Yes, you have an EU parliament which partly mitigates these, but as we tell you again in extension, one, it is largely unaccountable, and two, even to the degree we get a say, it is much less as a say when it comes to making legislation than we do of our own national government, if for no other reason than each 1/27th as represented, more or less, than they would be in national governments in the first place. As a result, we think you have your primary obligations to those individuals. This means we need to care primarily, if not exclusively, about what the impact is in those countries. We have several claims from closing opposition about these arguments. Firstly, they claim that you need to have free movement of labor in order to have free trade. I find this preposterous if you think when you have agreements like NAFTA, which don't have it, ASEAN, the fact the EU has trade agreements with almost every single trading bloc in the world, but at the same time you don't have free movement of labor. Their potential explanation is because you can't compete on internet, you can't compete with Germany if you're Bulgaria. This is simply untrue in most circumstances. Why? Because even if you cannot compete to make the same goods, you by and large make other goods, or you make the same goods in slightly different quality or cheaper. Simple theories of comparative advantage means that when you have free trade, many states gain even if you don't have free movement of labor. They secondly want to make have some obligation to the rest of the EU because there's something called EU values. I am unclear why this is the case. I am unclear why the EU should belong to EU and having EU citizenship should be something that we should believe is beneficial. But even if you do, note that we still ultimately are able to travel fairly easily. Note that in countries like China, where you have limits on internal migration, you still have plenty of people feeling Chinese. And even in the world right now, which they're talking about, where you have free movement of labor, I'm not convinced that you do have a lot of people feeling belong in the EU. The evidence we have is you look at the growth of anti-EU parties. Look at UKIP, look at the Front National, look at the Five Star Movement. The only other thing the previous speaker wanted to give us is some of the economic benefits of this policy to large countries. They say it could be good that you get this cheap labor. It could be, and that's why you should decide whether or not you take them in, rather than an obligation to take anyone in from the European Union. They say it is better that you take people in from the European Union than from other countries. I am unconvinced, and they don't give you a reason, why you have more cultural similarities with someone, the UK, and someone from Eastern Europe than you necessarily will with skilled migrants from former colonies. I think they assert that, but don't give you that argument at all. But even if not, I think we're more than happy to say that should be a decision of the individual countries. So why is this particularly harmful, beyond all those arguments, for the countries which accept those migrants? In the first place, the loss of jobs, as opening government tell you. More importantly, though, is that the limitations on states isn't just economic, but is often social. Why is this an issue? Because when you have small waves of immigration in, like you had in the 70s and 80s, before the advent of mass communication, before the advent of easy travel, it was much easier to integrate those individuals into the state. What did that mean? Well, compare it, for instance, with waves of migrations which occurred when you have, for instance, parts of the United Kingdom, parts of London, where you have Polish minorities effectively able to segregate themselves. Because there is a critical mass of them, they're able to effectively have their own supermarkets, use their own language everywhere, have their own newspapers. I don't necessarily want to say that is bad in and of itself, but definitely means you get far less social mixing when you have a critical mass of individuals in, which occurs when you don't have the ability to control the numbers in. Why is that a problem? One, it leads to hatred. This is both because large parts of the population now very rarely, if ever, interact with individuals of those minor ethnic groups. You don't have those kind of micro interactions, like, for instance, pubs and other social surroundings which can deal with those issues of hatred. Secondly, because you don't see those individuals, you often don't develop empathy within them. Why is this harmful? That's when you end up with far more xenophobia in the state. That is bad for those immigrants overall, and the most extreme cases you end up with racial abuse and racial violence, which has happened in parts of the UK. Even in other circumstances, you end up with more and more strength being given to anti-EU parties and xenophobic parties. We think these are all very serious harms as a result of this policy. Back off.
Sir.
Back off.
Okay, but still under your model, you're giving the right to xenophobics, that you're saying that yes, you're right, and we should stop this by stopping people moving.
So on one level, yes, we're doing something which xenophobic people want, but we think there are huge benefits of it. I don't think it necessarily has to empower the xenophobic movement, and indeed disempowers them. And that's our second claim on this, which the closing opposition never respond to. That ultimately, when you have economic and other problems within any single state, there are multiple of them. There can be the fact that you have inequality, you end up with low growth, high unemployment. But there's multiple factors which ultimately lead to that. There could, for instance, be tax rates being uncompetitive in your country or overly competitive. You could have, for instance, corporations with a great deal of power. You could have austerity movements by governments, all being reasons for why EU countries suffer as a great deal. Why exactly? And immigration could just be one of many of these issues. One of the problems is when governments have never taken decisive action against immigration, which is seen by the public, seen by the media, and seen by opposition parties to be a terrible reason, they often, to be a huge factor in it, you often ultimately ethnicize or explain the problems being caused as a result of immigration and immigration alone. Not necessarily immigration alone, but predominantly immigration. That is bad because it distracts from other issues that state has to do and other obligations of the government. Thus, you end up with less coherent policy. Finally, just very briefly on the state itself, we tell you end up with capital flight and brain drain. You don't end up with huge benefits for the states which lose labor. Their only claim, on the contrary, is remittance flows. While those did exist a while ago, now individuals tend to move from poorer countries to areas with which have high costs and at the same time low wages, so remittances are no longer a major factor. We're very happy to propose.
I thank that speaker for his fine speech, and I will be calling on the opposition.
May I? The closing opposition agrees that the countries do have the obligation towards their own citizens, but on the other hand, we also believe that the countries of the EU have actually obligations towards the EU citizens. Well, we never heard from the closing government actually how these countries will not fulfill the obligation towards their own citizens if you actually have free movement of people. We basically, all that we heard from the closing government, how actually they do not fulfill the obligations, is because people come and actually take lots of jobs and etc. And the nationals do not actually have. The nationals are left without jobs. Now, well, we believe this is not really the case, because as previously as Theodora has explained, the migrants mostly actually come, for example, they want to do this 3D, dirty, demanding, dangerous job that the nationals do not want to do. So they basically actually fulfill the shortage into the labor market. But even if that's not the case, and we do have sometimes preference of migrants over actually the nationals, we're completely actually fine with that, because basically we're all European citizens, and we do not see this as a very big problem. Now, what we heard basically from the closing government is that actually this economic argument about the goods and everything. But we believe basically that the countries, if you do not have this freedom of movement of people, is basically the countries that are now entering the EU are the ones that most suffering, because they basically have to have like lots of products, especially from the richer countries, which they have to compete on the market, and the EU is the one who is actually imposing the policies of how these products should look like, and actually on what kind of level these products are supposed to be. So we basically have problem that countries cannot come up to that level at the very same moment when they enter the EU, and they do have problems. But actually how they're compensated is that basically there is freedom of movement of people, and they can basically go into other countries, and at the same time the money flow is staying within the European Union. We see this as an economic benefit, and we believe it's great to have it. Now let's talk about the EU idea itself. Now what we actually have shown you is, first of all, that the European Union, with the sole fact that actually there are EU elections, that actually the people of the European Union gather together, go to elections in order to improve the policy and improve the situations on the EU level overall. We believe that basically when you actually have a body like such as the European Parliament, it has the obligation towards you as a European citizens. Now, why we believe it is basically very harmful if you actually limit this movement of people? Well, firstly, then you actually, although you say to a person, yes, you are a European citizen, but you cannot access the European Union in an easily way. Now, we believe actually as a European Union citizen, you should have this preferential status over citizens of the other countries, because you have become because you have become a part of this union. You basically should have the preferential status over someone who does not belong to the European Union. You shouldn't have actually restricted You shouldn't have restricted the freedom of movement, and you shouldn't have the same conditions applied to you, such as someone who does not belong to the European Union. Because basically in schools, people are constantly taught this European values, this freedom of movement idea, and etc. And now what you're basically saying is, although you're European Union, you cannot access that, even though we claim that you're European Union citizens. We see this we see this as basically a double standard. We see this as a double standard argument, and we actually do not support them. Now let's talk about the Euroscepticism itself. What the government has shown us today is basically, if we implement this kind of policy, we support the Euroscepticism itself. Because what we say, first of all, as Theodora has explained, there are there are lots of Eurosceptic political parties into the European Parliament. So what you're basically saying is that, yeah, your argument is legit, and basically what we are doing is actually banning, because that way we will actually have we will have less migrants into the countries, and we believe that this will be beneficial. This will be actually harmful for the parties themselves, because that way they're actually supporting the agenda even more. That way people see that actually people start to believe that their argument is legit, and that's the moment where actually Euroscepticism wins, and the support of the Eurosceptic parties into the government is actually even greater. Now, we also believe that this does not solve the xenophobic argument, because mostly the argument of these political parties that have this nationalistic agenda is not basically what kind of migrants are into the countries, but it is basically that there are migrants present into the countries. So you do not solve the problem basically of xenophobia and hatred towards the migrants, because according also under your model, you will still have them present into the countries, only in limited number, and you will actually make it harder for them to be there. Moreover, the xenophobia will increase. So if we actually see why the Euroscepticism came on the rise, it is basically because the countries were supposed to, because countries such as Germany, France, and etc. were supposed to pay the debts of the countries that are not that rich, and that basically that basically do not have the economic conditions to get themselves out of the economic crisis. So what we're actually doing is, because you do not provide these citizens the opportunities to go earn money, etc., and give them back to the countries, what you're basically doing is, after that you will still have to tax your own citizens in order to pay their debts, and this also increases the xenophobic argument and the hatred towards the migrants. Now let's talk a bit about preferential status within the European Union. So basically what the closing government especially has told us is that actually the migrants that come from the richer countries are the ones who integrate themselves better within these richer countries where they migrate. So basically when you actually have these visa conditions to apply, that means that actually you're going to make preferential status for migrants from rich countries over the migrants from the poorer countries, even though they actually belong to the European Union. Now we see this as very harmful, because we believe that mostly the migrants that come from the richest countries that actually have good economies and etc. will be preferred to come into the countries rather than the migrants that come actually from the poorer countries. We see this as harmful because that way, first of all, they're not able, for example, to access that much the higher education institutions. Well, we see one great benefit of the freedom of the movement within the European Union is that people basically could go educate themselves, and after that come back to their countries to contribute even more with their skills and knowledge that they gathered over there. Now we see this as very harmful, as it actually lacks, and it will lack when it comes to especially the citizens from the poorer countries. And the last point is that the last point that we will basically somehow have overflow is not true, because, for example, when the UK lifted the restrictions on Romania and Bulgaria, it was predicted that many Romanians will come into these countries, but that was basically not the case. So because we have shown you how actually it's a double standard to say that you are European citizens, but you cannot access the countries, and you not have a preferred status just because you're European Union, that Euroscepticism will be on the rise, and we believe that the poorer countries within the European Union will be excluded. We're very proud to oppose. Thank you.